All right, buckle up, because we're about to take a trip back in time so far back that even your great-great-great-grandmother would look like a newborn baby compared to what we're talking about. We're going all the way to 6,000 years ago, to a land wedged between two mighty rivers, where human beings, for the very first time in history, looked at the open sky above their heads and said, "You know what? I'm done sleeping under the stars. It's time to build something." And boy did they deliver. Picture this. It's around 4,000 BC. The Middle East is hot, dusty, and wild. There are no cities, no roads, no addresses, nothing. Just flat, sun-baked land stretching as far as the eye can see, with two massive rivers cutting through it all like nature's own highways. The Nile Tigris down to the east, the Euphrates down to the west. And right there, in that fertile strip of land between them, a place the ancient Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, which literally means the land between the rivers. Something extraordinary was beginning to happen. People were settling down, and when people settle down, they need a roof over their heads. Now here's the thing, and I want you to really sit with this for a second. Before the Sumerians, human beings had been wandering the earth for hundreds of thousands of years. They hunted, they gathered, they followed the animals, they slept in caves or makeshift shelters. The idea of a permanent home, a structure you build, live in, raise your children in, and pass down, that was revolutionary. That was a mind-blowing shift in how human beings understood themselves and their place in the world. Does that give you chills? Because it should. That moment, when the first Sumerian pressed mud into a brick with their bare hands, that's the moment that eventually led to every house, every apartment, every skyscraper you've ever seen. Wild, right? The Sumerians are honestly one of history's most underrated civilizations. Ask someone on the street about ancient history and they'll probably say Egypt, Greece, maybe Rome. But the Sumerians, they were doing things that would make your jaw drop long before the Egyptians were even thinking about pyramids. They invented writing. They invented the wheelbarrow. They developed the first legal codes, the first schools, the first libraries. They were basically the startup culture of the ancient world, always innovating, always building, always pushing boundaries. And their home base? The Bang city of Uruk, considered by many historians to be the very first city in human history. At its peak, around 3000 BC, Uruk had somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people living in it. In a world where most human groups were small tribes of a few dozen, this was absolutely mind-blowing. This was the ancient world's version of New York City. So how did they house all those people? How did they go from scattered huts to a full-blown urban civilization? That, my friend, is where the story gets really good. Here's something that might blow your mind. The Sumerians didn't have forests full of timber. They didn't have quarries full of stone. What they did have, in absolutely unlimited supply, was mud. Specifically, the thick, rich, clay-heavy mud from the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. And what did they do with it? They turned it into mud bricks. Arguably the most important invention in the history of construction. The process was deceptively simple. You take mud, you mix it with straw or reeds to give it strength. Kind of like adding rebar to concrete, if you think about it. You press it into a rectangular mold, and then you leave it out in the blazing Mesopotamian sun to dry and harden. That's it. That's the recipe. That's the technology that built an entire civilization. Now, I know what you're thinking. Mud bricks. Seriously. That sounds like something a kid does at the beach. But don't sleep on this. These bricks were durable, cheap, abundant, and effective. In a hot, dry climate, a well-made mud brick structure could last for decades, even centuries. And because the material was literally everywhere, anyone could build. Not just the rich, not just the powerful, anyone. You think that's not a big deal? Let me ask you something. What's the most important feature of a society where everyone can have a home? That's right. Stability. And stability is what allows civilization to grow. The earliest Sumerian structures weren't exactly glamorous. Let's be real. Around 1000–4000 BC, the first settled communities in Mesopotamia were building simple, rectangular huts. Single-room structures with walls of packed mud and roofs made from bundles of reeds laid across wooden poles. These were basically the ancient equivalent of a studio apartment. One room, low ceiling, one doorway, maybe a small opening for ventilation. No windows as we know them, no separate kitchen, no bathroom, just 4 walls and a roof. But what walls and a roof they were. But here's where the Sumerians showed their genius. They didn't stop there. They kept experimenting, kept improving, kept asking, how can we make this better? Within a few centuries, something remarkable started happening. Buildings started getting bigger. They started getting more complex. They started getting specialized rooms, a space for sleeping, a space for storing food, a space for receiving guests. The concept of the home as a multifunctional space yard was being born right there in the Mesopotamian mud. Doesn't that kind of remind you of the way technology evolves today? One generation has a flip phone, the next has a smartphone. One generation has a mud hut, the next has a multi-room house. Human beings have always been hungry for better. That hunger, that drive to improve, is maybe the most consistent thing about us across all of time. Okay, here's where things get really interesting. And I want you to pay close attention because this is genuinely fascinating. As Sumerian cities grew and became more crowded, architects, and yes, there were actual architects in ancient Sumer, developed what became one of the most elegant and enduring concepts in the history of human shelter: the courtyard house. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of building a single large room, you built a series of rooms arranged around a central open courtyard. This courtyard served as the heart of the home. It was where you cooked, where children played, where the family gathered in the cool of the evening. It was private, protected from the street, and open to the sky. Now think about this from a practical standpoint. In a climate with blazing summer heat, a courtyard provided shade and natural ventilation. The thick mud brick walls absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, keeping the interior cool. It was passive air conditioning, thousands of years before electricity. How clever is that? Seriously, does that not blow your mind a little bit? These people had no engineering schools, no architecture degrees, no textbooks. They figured this stuff out through pure observation, trial, and error. And the courtyard design was so effective that it spread across the entire ancient Near East and Mediterranean, and you can still find it in traditional homes in Iraq, Iran, and North Africa today. That's a 6,000-year track record. If something works, it works. Now, we've been talking about regular houses, homes for regular people, but no conversation about Sumerian building is complete without talking about the structures that truly announced to the world, we are here. We are building something that will last forever. I'm talking about the ziggurat. If you've never heard that word before, say it out loud. Ziggurat. It sounds like something from a fantasy novel, right? But these were very, very real. And they were the most ambitious construction projects the ancient world had ever seen. A ziggurat was essentially a massive, stepped pyramid temple. A series of terraced platforms stacked on top of each other, each level smaller than the one below, rising up toward the sky like a giant staircase to the heavens. They were built from, you guessed it, millions upon millions of mud bricks. Some were faced with kiln-fired bricks on the outside, which were stronger and more weather-resistant than sun-dried ones, sealed with bitumen may, a naturally occurring tar that acted as mortar and waterproofing. The most famous ziggurat is the Great Ziggurat of Ur, built around 2100 BC under the rule of King Ur-Nammu. This thing was massive, originally standing perhaps 830 meters tall, with a base measuring roughly 64 by 46 meters. It dominated the skyline of the city of Ur, the same way that Notre Dame dominated medieval Paris. At the top of the ziggurat, a temple, the house of the god. Because in Sumerian theology, the gods didn't live in the sky in some abstract way. They literally lived in the city, in the temple at the top of the ziggurat. The ziggurat was their earthly residence, and keeping it well maintained was the community's most sacred responsibility. Talk about putting pressure on your construction crew, huh? No pressure, guys. But if this falls down, the gods are homeless. Get it right. Here's something the history books don't always tell you. The people who built Sumer's great cities weren't faceless drones. They were craftsmen, specialists, and organized labor forces. Why? With sophisticated social structures. Archaeological evidence from sites like Uruk, Eridu, and Sartbash, Nippures, shows us that Sumerian construction involved highly organized work gangs, with foremen, administrators, and record keepers. Yes, they kept written records of construction projects, because the Sumerians invented writing partly to manage exactly this kind of large-scale organization. Workers received rations of barley and oil, the ancient equivalent of a paycheck. Skilled bricklayers, plasterers, and carpenters were valued specialists. There were people whose entire job was making bricks, professional brickmakers, thousands of years before professional anything was really a concept. And the sheer scales of production required is staggering. Researchers estimate that the Great Ziggurat of Ur required somewhere around 700,000 baked bricks just for its outer face. The total number of sun-dried bricks in its core, potentially in the millions, every single one made by hand. When you walk past a construction site today and see the cranes and the machinery and the concrete mixers, just take a moment to appreciate what it meant to build on that scale with nothing but human hands, wooden tools, and an unbelievable amount of patience. Makes you want to tip your hat to those ancient workers, doesn't it? Let's get down to the nitty-gritty, because I think one of the most interesting things about the Sumerians is how recognizable their domestic spaces are to us, even across 6,000 years of history. A typical middle-class Sumerian home, and yes, there was a middle class in ancient Sumer, consisted of several distinct areas. The entrance vestibule, a small transitional space between the street and the home's interior. Not just a door, but a room designed to prevent direct sight lines into the private courtyard. Privacy was already a value, even in 3000 BC. The central courtyard. Open to the sky, often with a drain in the center to collect rainwater. The main living and working area of the house during daylight hours. The reception room. Where guests were received, deals were made, and family business was conducted. The ancient equivalent of a formal living room. Sleeping quarters. Typically on an upper floor, accessed by a staircase of mud brick. Cooler at night, safer, more private. The kitchen and storage areas. Ground level, near the courtyard, with clay ovens for cooking flatbread and large ceramic jars for storing grain, oil, and beer. Yes, beer. The Sumerians were also the inventors of large-scale beer production. Because, of course, they were. A small shrine. Most Sumerian homes had a dedicated space for household religious practice. A niche in the wall, a small clay figurine, offerings of food. The divine was not separate from daily life. It was woven into every corner of the home. Honestly, you look at that layout and it's not that different from a house today, is it? Entryway, living room, bedroom, kitchen, a little corner for whatever gives you peace. Humans, man. We've been doing the same thing for 6,000 years. The Sumerians weren't just slapping mud together and hoping for the best. They developed genuinely sophisticated construction techniques that demonstrate a deep understanding of structural engineering. Foundation planning. Sumerian builders understood that buildings needed solid foundations, especially in the soft alluvial soil of Mesopotamia. Major structures were often built on raised platforms, or on top of the remains of earlier buildings, deliberately, to provide a more stable base. Some Sumerian cities show dozens of layers of construction, each one built on top of the rubble of the last, creating a kind of artificial hill called a tell. Arch and vault construction. Here's one that really surprises people. The Sumerians were using corbelled arches and vaulted ceilings as early as the 3rd millennium BC. The arch is often credited to the Romans, but the Sumerians were doing rudimentary versions of it millennia earlier. The ability to span an opening without a horizontal beam. That's a fundamental insight in structural engineering. Bitumen waterproofing. Mesopotamia sits on some of the world's largest natural petroleum deposits, and bitumen, a thick, tar-like substance, seeps naturally to the surface in many places. The Sumerians used it extensively as waterproof mortar and sealant, applying it between bricks and on foundations to prevent moisture damage. It's essentially ancient asphalt. They were waterproofing their buildings with the petroleum product 4,000 years before the oil industry existed. You tell me that's not genius-level resourcefulness? Go ahead, I dare you. Here's a perspective that I think really captures what made Sumer so extraordinary. They didn't just build buildings. They built cities as complete, integrated systems. Uruk, at its height, had a defensive wall that stretched for more than 9 kilometers, enclosing an area of around 600 hectares. Ancient tradition credited the building of this wall to the legendary king Gilgamesh, the same Gilgamesh of the world's oldest surviving piece of epic literature. Inside those walls, there were streets and alleyways. Not perfectly organized by any means, but clearly planned enough to allow movement and commerce. There were public spaces, temples, administrative buildings, and workshops alongside residential neighborhoods. There was a car drainage system. Clay pipes and channels built beneath the streets to carry away wastewater. Let that sink in for a moment. 6,000 years ago, people in Uruk had drainage infrastructure. Running water in the modern sense came much later, but the basic concept of managing water flow through a city? Sumer was there. There were harbors and canals. Because Mesopotamia's flat terrain meant that rivers and irrigation canals were the highways of their world. Cities were built to interface with water, with quays for boats, storage facilities for goods, and canals that brought water directly into urban areas for agriculture and daily use. It was, in every meaningful sense, an urban civilization. The first one humanity had ever produced. And it was built from the ground up, from scratch, with no template to follow, because they were the template. Everything that came after, Babylon, Assyria, Egypt's cities, ancient Greece, Rome, every city ever, owes something to what the Sumerians figured out in that flat, muddy land between two rivers. Here's the bittersweet part of the story, and it's a part worth sitting with. The Sumerians built in mud brick, and mud brick, for all its virtues, is not immortal. Unlike stone, it erodes, it dissolves in rain, it crumbles over centuries without maintenance. The great cities of Sumer didn't collapse in dramatic fashion, they just slowly melted back into the earth. By around 1000 BC, Sumerian civilization as a distinct cultural entity was fading. The Akkadians had absorbed much of it. The Amorites were rising. The political landscape of Mesopotamia was shifting. And the great cities, Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Nippur, declined, were abandoned, and over thousands of years were covered by the drifting sands of the Iraqi desert. For most of recorded history, the very existence of Sumerian civilization was unknown. It was only in the hot 19th century AD when European archaeologists began excavating the mysterious mounds dotting southern Iraq, that the world began to understand what lay beneath. They found bricks, they found pottery, they found clay tablets covered in a strange, wedge-shaped script. Cuneiform, the world's oldest writing system. And slowly, painstakingly, they pieced together the story of humanity's first great builders. The Sumerians had been forgotten for 4,000 years, and then they came back, because some things are too important to stay buried forever. I want to close with something personal, something real. Every time you walk into your home tonight, whether it's a house, an apartment, a small room you rent, I want you to think about this story. About the person 6,000 years ago, standing in the Mesopotamian sun with mud-covered hands, pressing that first brick into shape and thinking, I'm going to build something that lasts. They didn't know their work would echo through 6 millennia of human history. They didn't know that every architectural principle they discovered, the courtyard, the arch, the raised foundation, the drainage system, would be reinvented and refined by civilization after civilization, passing their knowledge forward like a torch through the darkness of time. They were just people, like you, like me, trying to build something solid in an uncertain world, trying to make a space that was theirs, safe, warm, sheltered from the storm. And isn't that, at the end of the day, what all of us are trying to do? Build something that lasts, make a place in the world, leave something behind worth remembering. The Sumerians did it first, and they did it with nothing but their hands, their ingenuity, and an endless supply of mud. Not bad for the world's first builders, huh? If this story hit different for you, if learning that a 6,000-year-old civilization figured out drainage, architecture, and urban planning before most of the world had figured out farming blows your mind even a little, then you already understand why history matters. Because we are not the first people to try to build something great. We're just the latest ones, and knowing that changes everything.